I think my bladder probably became a bit overactive. I just kind of vividly remember that even to this day. The internal alarm bells were ringing then. Hey friends, welcome back to the channel. My name is Rohan. I'm a 5th year medical student studying at the University of Cambridge. It's interview season, so I thought I'd take a trip down memory lane and remember and share with you what happened in my interview, how I was feeling leading up to the interview, and then what types of questions were asked, and then my reflections after the interview and my best advice for those having interviews this year, and if I was to do it again, what I'd like to do instead. So yeah, let's get into it. I was invited to interview pretty much this day, like 5 years ago, which is pretty scary to think about. But I think it was like the 23rd of November. It was right on the end of a Friday evening, and my interview invite was for 2 weeks later. So I guess there wasn't much time to actually start preparing for the Cambridge interview, but I'd already done a few mock interviews and started thinking about preparation before that, just in case I got the interview call up. Between getting the interview invite, so I was interviewed at Jesus College, and then the actual interview itself, there was a bit of paperwork I remember we had to submit, and Jesus College also gave us some information about who would be interviewing us and some guidance on general interview preparation, which was helpful but fairly generic. And yeah, basically between then and the interview, I was just trying to do as many mock interviews as I could, a lot of them with my teachers, but also with like friends. We'd just try quiz each other as much as we could. And then I was also kind of reviewing my A-level syllabus up to that point in all the sciences and maths, and just making sure also that I was familiar with my personal statement and doing a little bit of extra reading just so I had something interesting to talk about in case they asked if I was reading anything relating to medicine. I was trying to get all bases covered, but you know, it's quite difficult to prepare for Oxbridge interviews. Now, I do have a few videos on my channel about this topic, but it's really about getting this kind of holistic overview and trying to increase your interview skills, which will stand you in good stead, and this is what I was really trying to do, particularly through the mock interviews. So we decided to go down to Cambridge the night before and stay in a hotel, even though all my interviews were in the afternoon, just so, you know, I'd have some extra rest. And I also went with one of my friends and his dad, and my dad was also there, so it was 4 of us. I think that was good just to create a bit more of a relaxed atmosphere. If it was just me and my dad, I think I would have felt a bit more nervous. So the interviews were on a Friday afternoon. I think they were at 2:40 p.m, 3:40 p.m, and 4:20 p.m, so right at the end of the day, which is classic because my surname Yesudian is towards the end of the register. That morning I kind of woke up really slowly. I was just doing some like light reading of my notes and just trying to get in the right frame of mind. I remember my friend, he just had his interview, so we were talking about that over lunch. And then I remember we got on this taxi to go from the hotel to Jesus College. And I remember it had this like really dramatic Pirates of the Caribbean music. That kind of got me into like the right state of mind just to like, I don't know, just got the adrenaline pumping, and I just kind of vividly remember that even to this day. Okay, so now we actually get to the content of the interview itself. Now, I can't share the exact questions, but I will be sharing like the general themes and what my experience was going through each of the interviews. So as I mentioned, I had 3 interviews. 2 of them were like basically all science questions, and one was they asked a little bit about myself, and then also like a clinical scenario which I had to work through. The first interview went all right. They asked a few questions relating to genetics, and I just had to work stuff out. And they also got me to, they kind of described a scenario and I had to sketch a graph and then derive the equation. In general, I think it went okay because the interview content kind of built on what we'd already covered in A-level biology and also A-level maths. But I do remember being quite nervous and me making a few silly like arithmetic errors, and I think also in the equation I remember dropping a negative sign somewhere, which kind of complicated things for a little bit, but in the end it was all fine, and I think I got the right answers for both questions that they were asking. And the graph part of the interview, so I should have actually made this clear. So each interview you get 2 interviewers and they take it in turns to interview you. So each interview is kind of like in 2 halves, if you know what I mean, with one interviewer leading and the other one making notes while you're speaking. And yeah, the graph part of the interview, that was the second half. It was a bit more challenging and conceptual, but I actually enjoyed it because, I don't know, it just got me to think on my feet a little bit, and I think the interview was kind of upbeat and quite encouraging. So that was actually a fairly positive experience, but obviously our human mind, we always kind of dwell on our mistakes, so I thought I'd kind of messed up. I was a bit shaky with some of those arithmetic silly errors, but hopefully that was only due to nerves. And anyway, then the second interview, interview, I came out in the foyer, and basically in the foyer, I was a bit nervous that day, so I wasn't really interacting with any of the other candidates. Different people tackle nerves in different ways. Some people like talking to other people to take their mind off things or just to process things. I was very much like in my cocoon. I was like, no one talked to me. I kept going to the toilet because I was like, the last thing I want in my interview is to need the toilet. But I think my bladder probably became a bit overactive and then I just started going loads. But yeah, that's a separate issue. My second interview was also a science one, and this one I found a lot more challenging. Just because I thought they asked me like quite open-ended questions and I wasn't really sure what answers they were trying to get out of me. A lot of it was on the theme of immunology and infections, and I just remember getting really muddled up between a couple of the viruses I'd learned about in school. I remember I actually made like a basic factual error in one of my answers, but I actually didn't realize I'd made the error. Maybe I just misspoke. I remember the interviewer just kind of pausing and looking at me, but I was not sure what was happening, and he just kind of awkwardly carried on, so he didn't actually correct what I'd said, which maybe is a good thing, that ignorance is bliss, and I only realized a lot later, like after the interview, that I'd made a mistake. But at the same time, it probably wasn't the most ideal situation. But they were also asking a lot of questions which I think I did know the general answer to. Like obviously there's different layers of complexity, what you learn at school compared to what you learn at university. But I think I was giving all the answers to a level of detail that they were expecting. But then the next part of the interview, this was taken by the second interviewer. She asked me to like describe an experiment which I'd done in either my biology or chemistry courses. But for some reason, I decided to be a bit unique, a bit difficult, and I asked if I could describe an experiment from physics, and she said okay. I started describing it, and I was describing like experiment where you kind of drop these ball bearings and then use like the measurements you make to calculate that acceleration due to gravity is 9.8 or something. Anyway, I don't think she was super impressed with my description because she asked me to have another go at this. And the internal alarm bells were ringing then because I was like, my gosh, I tried to be super smart, but it just completely backfired on me. So then I tried describing an experiment which we'd done kind of early on in my A-level biology course. And then again, she got me to sketch a graph. So I think that's something, if you want to take away from this, they kind of like you being able to sketch a graph, either of your results, as is in this case, or in response to a scenario which you're describing, which was in my first interview. And yeah, I remember just giving a kind of really basic answers to the follow-up questions. So I did feel like quite rattled after that second interview when I was coming out. But thankfully, immediately after I came out from that second interview, I went to the foyer and immediately called me for the third interview because there wasn't really much crossover time. I think that was a blessing in disguise because I didn't have any time to ruminate about what was going on. I was literally taken from the second interview to the foyer, then immediately to the last interview. I remember sitting in this person's office just on my own, and I was trying to look at all their posters, I think it was of their research, up on the walls, trying to get some clues about what the contents of the interview might be. And this was one thing I wanted to add. So a lot of people online will go, look up like what subject area your interviewers do research in, because this might be the content of your interview. I've seen this a lot on YouTube, and it seems to be true for some people, but for me, it didn't really help. The last interview had a lot more of a gentle start. So they started by asking questions about me, about my general motivation and insight into medicine, and just the whole vibe of this interview was different. I remember we were sitting on sofas, whereas in the other interviews, there was like a table, desk and chair between myself and the interviewers. So it was a lot more different vibe, and I thought I was able to quite confidently answer the questions where they're asking about myself, and I think we also talked a little bit about a book which I'd mentioned in my personal statement. And then they started asking about a clinical scenario where they wanted me to try work out the answer. Actually, I remember this taking like at least 10 minutes or so. The majority of the interview, we were working on this clinical scenario. I didn't actually get the answer they were looking for. I just remember trying all sorts of different answers and attacking the problem from all different angles. And although I didn't get the final answer correct, I think they still appreciated that I was really sharing my rationale. And even at the end, after they told me the answer, then I asked a follow-on question from that, just to show that I was, trying to learn from the experience. So anyway, that was it. After that, we pretty much immediately drove back home because it was quite a long distance. Obviously, when the dust settled and I was kind of alone with my thoughts, I was quite sad about what happened because I just kept thinking about that second interview, making those factual errors, and then I thought I didn't portray the best version of myself. And I honestly honestly thought I'd blew it. So I was thinking, like, in general, I think there's a 1 in 4, 1 in 5 applications per place in Cambridge. So if you think about like 20% chance of getting in general, I was saying post-interview, I thought my chances had decreased. So I thought I was only looking at a 5 or 10% chance. Afterwards, I tried not thinking about too much about how the interview went. We went to India that Christmas. I also had another interview at Nottingham just 2 days later. So I did have to refocus, and the holidays were pretty good just to relax. I only had one more interview in early January, that was at Imperial. And yeah, we heard back about like the results from the interviews and whether we got offers in the third week of January, which was definitely the earliest out of all the medical schools I'd applied to. And I remember that day, everyone seemed to be getting their decision emails like earlier in the day throughout the morning. But as usual, because of my surname, I think mine was one of the last, I'm guessing. I remember it was lunchtime, I was in the lunch queue, and then I checked my phone. And I remember I saw an email from Robinson College. Now, up to that point, I'd never heard of Robinson College, and I didn't know it was a Cambridge college. Now, obviously, I do now because they made me an offer, and thanks be to God for His grace in allowing me to come here. Just to clarify, how did I get interviewed at Jesus and then get an interview at Robinson College? I was put and accepted through something called the Winter Pool. It's basically a system which makes sure you don't get disadvantaged, even if you apply to a more quote-unquote competitive college which has more applications, because even if your interview performance and your general application is strong enough, they put you in the winter pool, and it allows any college to make you an offer if they look at your application and think it's strong enough. So that's what happened with me, and actually 2 other people in my year. So my year for Robinson Medics were only 9, and of our year, 3 people had exactly the same scenario. They interviewed at Jesus and got accepted at Robinson. I think that year Jesus had quite a few applications. They were really oversubscribed. Looking back at things, obviously I've had a lot of time to reflect on my interviews. My reflections and my general advice to you is to not beat yourself up about simple mistakes. I made plenty of mistakes over the course of my interviews, but I think they're more interested in kind of your general approach to the questions, and that you're actively engaging with whatever information they're giving you, and you're trying your utmost to work towards the right answer. And even if you don't get to the final answer, I think it's more they're looking at whether you're a teachable person at the end. Because at the end of the day, these interviewers, a lot of them will be your teachers in the first few years of your academic studies if you're successful at getting a place at that college. They're really trying to see, can you take on new information and apply that to new situations. Just to cap off this video, I remember actually a few days later, I wrote down on a form like my advice to future applicants. So these are all advice from year 13 me. This is before I even knew I got an offer from Cambridge. These were just kind of my immediate reflections on my top tips to you. Number 1 is revise human biology. Quite a lot of human biology came up over the course of my interviews. Not only that, some maths came up in the first interview. Some organic chemistry also came up. So they can ask anything from the maths and sciences. So just being really familiar with your A-level content so far will be really helpful. Number 2 is to read around the subject. I mentioned this before. I've created a reading list for prospective applicants. Anything recent which you've read, if you just keep a bookmark on your web browser, for example, if it's an internet article. And what I was doing in the 24 hours leading up to the interview was kind of just reviewing these bookmarks, which I'd been keeping for several months, almost a year, and just kind of reminding myself of all like the interesting stuff kind of relating to medicine which I'd read about, which was pretty good. Number 3 and number 4 are kind of similar, but they're to stay calm and to relax between the interviews. Between interviews, I wasn't looking at my notes and stuff. I was just kind of trying to, apart from going to the toilet, I was also kind of walking around the courtyard and some of the gardens and Jesus. I was just trying to relax and take my mind off things, and even trying to stay calm during the interview. I think I did this well, particularly just after the second interview and starting the third interview. I just tried to refocus as much as I could, and that went well. And I think finally, and this is my top thing for preparing for interviews, is to do as many mock interviews as you can. And this is where I'm so grateful for all the teachers who did do mock interviews for me at my school. I know this is over 5 years ago, so I'm not sure if any of them are watching here, but each one of them was helpful in ways which I couldn't have imagined. Each one, like even my physics teacher, we did some random question about x-rays, and again, we were like sketching graphs on the whiteboard one lunchtime. And I was thinking like, oh, how is this actually going to be helpful? I mean, I guess it's medical imaging, but how is it actually going to be helpful for my interview? But actually those skills was something which directly helped me in one of my interviews, and that's to do with like the sketching graphs and also doing equations and things. So I'm hugely indebted to them. I'm sure some of you are thinking, you know, how can I do some mock interviews? My teachers at the school aren't offering them. And I know a lot of the interviews are still online, even post-COVID, a lot of them are remaining to be online. I have written a few mock questions and assimilated some questions myself. I've been doing it for a few years now, so if you wanted a mock interview over Zoom, there's a booking form and a document in the description box below where you can find out more. Anyway, I think that's enough for this video. Thank you so much for watching. If you found it helpful, please consider subscribing to this channel. And you can also find a lot more interview resources on my channel, like mock interviews and stuff for MMI interviews, which you might find helpful. But anyway, take care. I wish you all the best for your interviews this year, and bye for now.